Welcome to the shadowy corners of the internet, where the line between reality and the unknown fades. I am Mr. Dark, your guide into the depths of fear and mystery. Tonight, I bring you a tale so chilling, so unnerving, that it will leave you questioning the roads you travel and the choices you make. Imagine a snow-covered highway, an abandoned sack, and a sinister force that stalks its victims with relentless hunger. A group of strangers thought they were on a routine journey until the shadows closed in and the nightmare began. Stay with me as we unravel the terrifying legend of the haunted highway. But be warned, some roads should never be traveled, and some stories are more than just stories. Let's start. The winter night stretched long and unforgiving, wrapping the Appalachian landscape in an icy shroud of mist and silence. David adjusted his heavy coat as he climbed into the driver's seat of his old coach bus, the vehicle groaning like an aging animal waking from sleep. It was his 5th night running the late route through the mountains, a shift he hated but couldn't afford to refuse. The extra pay meant keeping the lights on and the bills paid. As the engine rumbled to life, Charlie, his jittery conductor, appeared at the door, stamping snow off his boots. "You ready for this, Dave?" Charlie asked, his voice tinged with unease. "Heard the fog so thick tonight you could cut it with a knife." David sighed, pulling his cap lower over his brow. "It's a road like any other, Charlie. We'll manage." The bus route, known locally as Hollow Bend Highway, had gained a reputation for more than just treacherous curves and bad weather. Over the years, truckers and night travelers swapped tales of strange sights. A ghostly woman standing at mile marker 13, lights flickering without cause, and most chillingly, an eerie sack found abandoned in the middle of the road, said to belong to a long-dead occultist. David dismissed the stories as tall tales, but Charlie, not so much. "We shouldn't be driving this stretch at night," Charlie muttered, clutching the charm of St. Michael he wore around his neck. "Tell that to the paycheck," David replied, checking the headlights. By the time the passengers boarded, the storm had worsened. Snowflakes the size of coins swirled around the bus, illuminated briefly by its lights, before vanishing into the dense fog. David counted 4 passengers in total. A young man in his 20s who looked restless, a middle-aged couple bundled in matching parkas, and a tall figure in a long coat and clerical collar. The priest lingered a moment before stepping aboard, as if debating whether to trust the bus at all. "Welcome aboard, Father," Charlie greeted nervously. "I hope you're not heading anywhere too far tonight." "Far enough," the priest replied cryptically, his voice calm, but carrying an edge of something David couldn't place. The bus pulled away from the terminal, its tires crunching against the snow-packed road. David kept his eyes forward, the world outside reduced to a swirling blur of grey. The first 20 minutes passed in silence, save for the occasional cough or shifting of a passenger in their seat. It wasn't long before the tension began to creep in. The bus headlights caught something on the side of the road, a shadowy figure standing in the snow, motionless. David's heart skipped, but he dismissed it as a trick of the light. "Did you see that?" Charlie asked, his voice trembling. "No," David lied, gripping the wheel tighter. They passed the stretch without incident, but the air inside the bus felt heavier. The couple murmured softly to each other. The young man, Eli, leaned his head against the window, pretending not to notice. The priest sat near the back, his head bowed as if in prayer. By the time they reached mile marker 13, David began to feel the strain of driving. The fog was thicker here, swallowing the bus's high beams. He slowed the vehicle to a crawl, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. It was Charlie who spotted the first real anomaly. "David, stop the bus." David glanced at him, annoyed. "Why? What now?" "There's someone out there." David squinted into the fog. At first there was nothing, just the endless grey. Then he saw it. a figure standing in the middle of the road. The man, if it was a man, wore a tattered coat and clutched a large burlap sack. The headlights revealed a smudge of red on the sack, like blood, but David told himself it could have been paint. "I'm not stopping for that," David said firmly, pressing the gas. "Are you crazy?" Charlie hissed. "You want to run him over?" David sighed and eased the bus to a halt. The figure remained still, head bowed. Snow swirled around him, but he didn't shiver or move. Charlie opened the bus door and called out, "Hey, you need help?" The figure raised its head slowly, and for a moment David thought he saw the impossible, eyes glowing faintly red. He blinked, and the glow was gone. "Can I get a ride?" the man rasped, his voice like gravel. "Just a short way down." David hesitated. Something about the man set his instincts on edge. The sack shifted in his hands, as if something inside it moved. "Sorry, buddy, we're full," David lied. "There's plenty of room," the man replied, stepping closer. His boots crunched on the icy road, and David noticed faint red marks trailing in the snow behind him, footprints that seemed too deep for a normal person. "I said no," David snapped, slamming the door shut. The man stood motionless as the bus rolled away. In the rearview mirror, David swore he saw him smile, a chilling, toothy grin. "That wasn't right," Charlie muttered, fidgeting with his charm. "You shouldn't have left him there." David ignored him, focusing on the road ahead. But as they continued, an unsettling realization crept over him. The snow-covered footprints were appearing again, this time on the road ahead, leading them towards something unseen. The bus lumbered forward, the rumble of its engine the only sound cutting through the oppressive silence. Inside, the passengers were tense, the earlier chill in the air replaced by an almost suffocating unease. Charlie fidgeted beside David, his fingers twitching against the seat's edge. "Footprints," Charlie muttered, staring out the windshield. "How the hell are there footprints ahead of us, Dave? We left that guy behind." David clenched the wheel tighter, ignoring him. The fog swirled like living smoke, thickening as the bus crawled up the winding mountain road. The snow-covered ground glistened under the headlights, and sure enough, there were the footprints, leading onward, as if guiding them. "They're just a trick of the snow," David said, his voice hard but shaky. "Nothing more." "Sure doesn't look like nothing," Charlie whispered, pressing his charm to his lips. In the back, the passengers stirred. The young man, Eli, had been leaning against the window but now sat upright, his brows furrowed. "What's going on up there?" he called out. "Nothing," David replied, not taking his eyes off the road. "Just some bad weather." The priest, seated at the far end of the bus, looked up for the first time. His eyes, calm but piercing, met David's in the rear-view mirror. "You should stop the bus," he said quietly. David's grip on the wheel tightened. "And do what? Wait for a search party to find us next spring? We keep going." The priest's gaze lingered a moment longer before he returned to his prayers, the faint murmur of Latin filling the air. Madeline and George, the middle-aged couple, exchanged worried glances, but said nothing. Then came the sound, a faint thump, like something tapping against the side of the bus. David froze, his heart racing. The tapping grew louder, rhythmic, as if something, or someone, was keeping pace with the vehicle. "What the hell is that?" Charlie whispered, his voice trembling. "I'm not stopping," David snapped, pressing harder on the accelerator. The bus shuddered as it picked up speed, the headlights cutting through the fog in uneven slices. The thumping stopped. For a moment, there was only the hum of the engine and the soft whine of the tires against the icy road. Then, with a metallic screech, the bus lurched violently to one side, forcing David to slam on the brakes. "What now?" he growled, his voice laced with panic. Charlie peered out the side window, his face draining of color. "Dave, look." David turned his head slowly. The burlap sack. The same one the man had been carrying earlier was now lying in the middle of the road, just ahead of the bus. Its rough surface glistened wetly under the headlights, and something inside it shifted, pressing against the fabric as though struggling to escape. "No way," David muttered. "There's no way that's the same damn sack." Eli stood up, his face pale. "What sack? What are you talking about?" Madeline clutched George's arm, her eyes wide. "We should go back. This feels wrong." "No one's going anywhere," David barked. "I'm driving us out of here." The priest rose from his seat and moved to the center aisle, his presence commanding despite his quiet demeanor. "Driver," he said, his voice calm but firm, "this isn't just a storm. Something is here." Before David could respond, the lights inside the bus flickered, casting the interior in alternating shadows and weak yellow light. The engine sputtered, and for a chilling moment, the bus went completely silent. Then came the knocking, not from the door or the sides of the vehicle this time, but from the roof. Thump, thump, thump. David and Charlie froze. The passengers gasped, huddling closer together. The knocking moved slowly from the back of the bus toward the front, each impact rattling the vehicle. "Drive!" Charlie hissed, his voice high-pitched with terror. "I can't," David said through gritted teeth, twisting the ignition. The engine sputtered but wouldn't catch. Thump, thump. The sound stopped directly above David. He didn't dare look up. His breath came in shallow gasps, the silence pressing down on him like a weight. Then the windshield cracked. A thin fissure appeared in the center of the glass, spiderwebbing outward. David barely had time to register it before the sack outside began to move. It writhed violently, as if something inside was clawing to get free. The red stain grew darker, spreading across the coarse fabric like fresh blood. "Nope," Eli said, standing abruptly. "I'm not staying in here. Open the doors." "Sit down," David barked. "Are you kidding me?" Eli shot back, pointing toward the sack. "There's something in there. What the hell are we waiting for?" Before David could respond, the priest stepped forward. "You can't outrun this," he said softly. "It isn't bound by the rules of our world." David stared at him, his pulse hammering in his ears. "What the hell are you talking about?" "The man you left behind," the priest continued, his voice calm despite the chaos. "He wasn't a man, and that sack, what it carries, will never stop." As if on cue, the sack ripped open with a deafening tear, revealing a gnarled skeletal hand covered in blackened flesh. The fingers twitched, clawing at the air. "Oh my God," Madeline whispered, clutching George. "It's real." The lights flickered again, and for a split second, the figure of the man they had left behind appeared at the front of the bus, grinning that same toothy grin. "Drive!" Charlie screamed. The engine roared to life, and David slammed his foot on the accelerator. The bus jerked forward, narrowly missing the sack as it sped down the highway. In the rearview mirror, David caught a glimpse of the figure standing in the middle of the road, its head tilted unnaturally to one side. It didn't move, but its grin followed them long after the fog swallowed it whole. The bus careened down the winding mountain road, its headlights slicing through the dense fog. Inside, the passengers clung to their seats, terror radiating from their faces. David gripped the wheel tightly, his knuckles white, while Charlie sat frozen, muttering incoherently under his breath. The oppressive silence was broken by Eli's sharp question. "What the hell was that thing?" David didn't answer, his focus locked on the narrow road ahead. The bus shuddered with each turn, the tires slipping slightly on patches of black ice. In the rearview mirror, the figure they'd left behind loomed in David's mind, its grin etched into his memory. "It's following us," Madeline whispered, her voice trembling. "Don't look back." the priest warned from his seat, his calm demeanor masking a growing urgency. Looking feeds it. What do you mean, feeds it? George demanded, his arm protectively around his wife. Are you saying this thing is alive? The priest's silence spoke volumes. Ahead, the road narrowed further, the steep drop on one side shrouded in darkness. Snow began to fall more heavily, thick flakes blurring the windshield. David squinted, barely able to make out the twisting path. Then, without warning, the engine sputtered. No, no, no! David slammed his palm against the dashboard as the bus slowed to a crawl. He fought the wheel, desperate to keep it moving, but the vehicle came to a jarring stop. "What's wrong?" Charlie asked, panic rising in his voice. David tried the ignition, but the bus refused to start. "Damn thing's dead." "Oh, God!" Madeline whimpered, clutching George's arm. Eli stood, his breath fogging in the cold air. "We can't stay here. If that thing is still out there—" "It is," the priest interrupted, his gaze fixed on the dark forest beyond the windows. "And it's closer than you think." As if on cue, the sound of footsteps echoed outside, crunching softly in the snow. The passengers froze, their eyes darting toward the windows. The fog pressed against the glass like a living thing, its shifting patterns hiding what lay beyond. Then came the tapping. It was faint at first, a gentle rapping against the back of the bus. Everyone turned, their breaths caught in their throats. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, moving along the side of the bus until it reached the front. "David," Charlie whispered, his voice barely audible. "We need to get out of here." David hesitated, his instincts warring with his fear. The tapping stopped abruptly, replaced by a deep guttural growl that seemed to reverberate through the vehicle. "Out!" the priest said firmly, standing. "Now!" No one argued. David grabbed a flashlight from under his seat and opened the bus doors, the cold air rushing in like a slap to the face. He stepped out first, scanning the fog-shrouded forest. The snow-covered ground glowed faintly under the light, but the trees beyond were an impenetrable wall of shadows. "Stick together," the priest instructed as the passengers disembarked one by one. "Stay close, and don't stray from the group." "Where are we supposed to go?" George asked, his voice quavering. "There's nothing out here but trees and snow." "We head for the highway," David said, his voice firm despite the fear clawing at him. "It can't be far." The group moved cautiously into the forest, their footsteps muffled by the snow. David led the way, the flashlight beam flickering as he swept it back and forth. The fog clung to them like a second skin, muffling their voices and the sound of their movement. "Do you hear that?" Eli whispered, glancing over his shoulder. "Hear what?" Madeline asked, her eyes darting nervously. "Breathing," Eli replied, his voice barely audible. "It's close." David stopped abruptly, shining the flashlight behind them. The beam cut through the fog, revealing nothing but snow and trees. The group huddled together, their breaths visible in the freezing air. "We need to keep moving," the priest said, his voice steady but urgent. They pressed on, the forest closing in around them. The trees seemed to lean closer, their skeletal branches clawing at the sky. The footsteps that had once been theirs now sounded heavier, slower, as if something much larger was following them. Then they saw it, the burlap sack. It lay just ahead, half buried in the snow, its red stain stark against the white. The group stopped in their tracks, fear freezing them in place. "That wasn't here before," Charlie stammered. The sack moved. A collective gasp rippled through the group as the sack began to writhe, something inside clawing to get out. The fabric tore, and a skeletal hand emerged, its blackened fingers curling toward them. "Run!" David shouted, breaking the spell. The group bolted, plunging deeper into the forest. The snow slowed their progress, their feet sinking with every step. The sound of something massive crashing through the trees behind them spurred them on, their fear outweighing their exhaustion. "Over here!" the priest called, pointing to a faint light in the distance. It was a cabin, its windows glowing faintly through the fog. The group stumbled toward it, their breaths ragged. David reached the door first, throwing it open and ushering everyone inside. The cabin was small and sparsely furnished, but the warmth of a fire crackling in the hearth was a welcome relief. David slammed the door shut, bolting it as the others collapsed onto the floor or chairs. "Is it gone?" Madeline asked, her voice shaking. Before anyone could answer, the growl returned, louder this time and much closer. The group fell silent, their eyes locked on the door as the sound of footsteps approached. The floorboards creaked under an unseen weight, and the growl deepened into a low, guttural snarl. "It knows we're here," the priest said grimly, clutching the crucifix around his neck, "and it won't stop." The air inside the cabin felt heavy, the warmth of the fire doing little to dispel the bone-deep chill that had settled over the group. Outside, the footsteps grew louder, circling the cabin, deliberate and slow. Whatever stalked them wanted them to know it was there. David stood by the bolted door, clutching a fire poker he had grabbed from the hearth. His hand trembled, but he held the weapon tightly, his jaw clenched. "It's playing with us," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "It doesn't need to play," the priest replied, his gaze fixed on the wooden planks of the door. "It's waiting." "For what?" Charlie asked, his voice high and panicked. "For us to just give up? I'm not dying like this." "No one's dying," David snapped, though he didn't sound convinced. The priest turned to the group, his face somber but calm. "It's not just here to kill you. It wants something else. Your fear, your submission. If you give it that, it will take you apart piece by piece." "Oh, great," Eli said, pacing the small room. "So we just have to not be afraid of the giant demon thing stalking us in the middle of nowhere. That's your big plan?" Before the priest could respond, the growling outside stopped. The sudden silence was deafening, the absence of sound pressing down on them like a weight. The fire in the hearth flickered, the flames dimming to an eerie blue. "Something's wrong," Madeline whispered, clutching George's arm. "Stay away from the windows," the priest warned, his voice sharp. But Charlie didn't listen. Driven by a mix of panic and curiosity, he crept toward the frost-covered window, peering out into the fog-shrouded darkness. "What do you see?" Eli asked, his voice hushed. Charlie didn't answer at first. Then he stepped back, his face pale, his eyes wide with terror. It's standing right there." The group froze. David gripped the fire poker tighter, moving toward Charlie. "What is?" Charlie pointed a shaking finger toward the window. "It's him, the guy with the sack. He's just standing there, staring at us." "No," the priest said firmly. "That's not a man anymore. It's something else." As if on cue, the door rattled violently, the wooden planks creaking under the force. Everyone jumped, their fear palpable. "Don't open it!" Madeline cried, her voice breaking. "I wasn't planning to," David shouted back, bracing himself against the door. The rattling stopped abruptly. For a moment, the only sound was their own ragged breathing. Then a low voice, deep and gravelly, spoke from the other side of the door. "You shouldn't have left me behind." David's blood turned to ice. The voice was unmistakable. It was the man they had abandoned on the highway. But how? That thing couldn't be human, not anymore. "What do you want?" the priest called out, stepping forward. His voice was steady, but his grip on his crucifix tightened. The voice on the other side chuckled, a sound devoid of warmth. "You know what I want. You all saw me. You know what I carry. And now, you're mine." The fire in the hearth flared suddenly, casting grotesque shadows on the cabin walls. The shadows twisted and writhed, forming unnatural shapes that seemed to move with a life of their own. Eli backed away from the walls, his breath coming in gasps. "This isn't real. This can't be real." "It's very real," the priest said. He turned to the group, his expression grim. "We have to face it. Hiding won't save us." "Face it?" George barked. "Are you out of your mind? You want us to just walk out there and—" Before he could finish, the door exploded inward with a deafening crash. Splinters flew through the air, and the group screamed as a towering figure stepped into the cabin. It was the man, or what was left of him. His skin was pale and stretched tight over his bones, his eyes glowing with an unnatural red light. The burlap sack hung from his shoulder, dripping dark, viscous liquid onto the floor. "You've run far enough," the thing growled, its voice echoing unnaturally. David swung the fire poker, but the creature caught it mid-swing, snapping it in half like a twig. It tossed the broken pieces aside and advanced on him, its grin widening to reveal jagged, blood-stained teeth. "Back off!" Charlie shouted, throwing a wooden stool at the creature. It shattered against its chest, but the monster didn't even flinch. Instead, it turned its glowing eyes on Charlie, who stumbled backward, his courage evaporating. The priest stepped forward, holding his crucifix aloft. "In the name of God, I command you to leave!" The creature hissed, its grin fading into a snarl. "Your God has no power here," it spat, swiping at the priest with clawed hands. The crucifix glowed faintly, but the creature swatted it away, sending the priest sprawling to the floor. "We can't fight this!" Madeline screamed, clutching George. "We don't have a choice!" David yelled, grabbing a burning log from the hearth. He swung it at the creature, the flames licking at its face. It recoiled, letting out an unearthly shriek that made the cabin walls vibrate. "Keep it back!" the priest shouted, scrambling to his feet. "Don't let it get close!" David advanced, wielding the burning log like a weapon. The creature snarled, its glowing eyes narrowing. It lunged suddenly, its claws raking across David's arm. He cried out in pain, dropping the log. "David!" Charlie shouted, rushing to his side. "Get out of here!" David yelled, clutching his bleeding arm. "Run!" But before anyone could move, the creature turned its attention to Eli, who had been frozen in fear near the back of the cabin. It grinned again, advancing slowly. "You're the youngest," it said, its voice dripping with malice. "So much life left to take." "Stay away from him," the priest shouted, stepping between Eli and the creature. He held up his hands, his voice rising in a desperate prayer. "By the power of the holy light, I cast you out." The creature shrieked again, but this time it faltered, its movements jerky and disjointed. The shadows on the walls seemed to retreat, and the fire in the hearth burned brighter. "It's working!" Madeline cried. The priest continued his prayer, his voice steady and strong. The creature thrashed, its claws raking at the air as if trying to escape. The burlap sack slipped from its shoulder, landing on the floor with a sickening squelch. The priest stepped closer, his crucifix glowing faintly. "You have no power here," he said firmly. "Return to the void." With a final, ear-splitting scream, the creature dissolved into a swirling mass of shadows, which seeped into the sack. The burlap twitched once, then fell still. The group stared in stunned silence, their breaths coming in gasps. The priest dropped to his knees, clutching his crucifix tightly. Is it gone?" Charlie asked, his voice shaking. "For now," the priest replied, his voice weary. "But it's not over." The cabin stood deathly silent, the aftermath of the confrontation settling over the group like a suffocating fog. The creature was gone, but its presence lingered, an unseen weight pressing on their chests, filling the air with unease. The burlap sack lay on the floor, limp and motionless, its edges charred and blackened from the priest's prayer. David slumped against the wall, clutching his bleeding arm. Charlie knelt beside him, using a torn piece of his own shirt to bind the wound. "You're lucky it didn't take your whole arm," he muttered shakily. his eyes darting nervously toward the sack. David grimaced, his face pale from the pain. Lucky. Sure feels like it. Eli was still pressed against the far wall, his chest heaving as he tried to calm his racing heart. What the hell just happened? He managed to choke out. What was that thing? The priest, his face drawn and weary, rose to his feet. He picked up his crucifix, the faint glow now gone, and turned to face the group. That was the manifestation of something deeply evil, a fragment of a curse tied to this land. It feeds on fear, pain, and death, and we've only driven it back, not destroyed it. Not destroyed it? Madeline exclaimed, clutching George's arm. After everything we just went through, you're saying it's still out there? The priest nodded grimly. The curse runs deep. It was born from the violent death of a man who tampered with forces he couldn't control. His anger, his desperation, they gave rise to this thing. As long as that energy lingers, the curse will remain. George swore under his breath, pacing the small cabin. So what now? We just wait for it to come back? No, the priest said, his voice steady. We leave. The further we are from this place, the weaker its hold on us. David straightened, wincing as he pushed off the wall. And what happens to anyone else who ends up out here? What about the next poor soul who drives that highway? The priest's gaze darkened. I can't save everyone, but I can warn them. That's not good enough, Eli snapped, anger and fear mixing in his voice. That thing almost killed us, and it's just going to keep killing unless someone stops it. The priest turned to Eli, his eyes piercing. Would you stop it? Would you risk your soul to face it again? Because that's what it would take. It's not a simple monster to be slain. It's a force tied to this land, rooted in pain and sacrifice. Eli opened his mouth to argue, but closed it again, his jaw tightening. He looked away, unable to meet the priest's gaze. David exhaled sharply, grabbing the flashlight from the floor. We're not solving anything by standing here. Let's get moving before that thing comes back. The group nodded reluctantly, gathering their strength to leave the cabin. The priest led the way, his crucifix clutched tightly in one hand. David and Charlie followed, supporting each other, with Eli, Madeline, and George bringing up the rear. Outside, the forest was unnervingly quiet. The snow had stopped, leaving the ground blanketed in a pristine white that reflected the pale light of the moon. The fog had thinned, revealing the twisted skeletal trees that surrounded them. Stay close, the priest said softly, his eyes scanning the shadows. It's not gone, just weakened. As they made their way through the forest, the tension in the group was palpable. Every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves made them jump, their nerves frayed to the breaking point. David kept the flashlight trained on the path ahead, but the beam flickered sporadically, casting erratic shadows. "What's that?" Charlie whispered, pointing toward a faint glow in the distance. The priest squinted, his expression hardening. "The highway. We're close." A flicker of hope sparked in the group, and they quickened their pace. The trees began to thin, and the faint glow of streetlights became clearer. Relief washed over them as they stepped onto the asphalt of the deserted road. "We made it," Madeline breathed, tears streaming down her face. "We're alive." But the priest's expression remained grim. "Alive, yes, but not untouched." "What does that mean?" George demanded, his voice sharp. Before the priest could answer, the sound of a car engine echoed through the night. Headlights appeared in the distance, growing brighter as the vehicle approached. David stepped into the road, waving his arms. "Hey, stop! We need help!" The car slowed, its tires crunching against the snow, and came to a stop a few feet away. The driver, a middle-aged man with a concerned expression, rolled down his window. "Are you folks okay?" "We need a ride," David said, relief flooding his voice. "Our bus broke down." The man glanced at the group, his brow furrowing. "Looks like you've been through hell. Get in. I'll take you to town." One by one, the group climbed into the car, squeezing into the cramped space. The priest was the last to enter, his eyes lingering on the forest behind them before he shut the door. As the car pulled away, silence filled the cabin. No one spoke, the events of the night weighing heavily on them. David stared out the window, his mind racing. They were safe, for now. But deep down, he knew the priest was right. The curse wasn't broken. As the car rounded a bend in the highway, David caught a glimpse of something in the rearview mirror. A figure stood at the edge of the forest, watching them. Its glowing red eyes pierced through the darkness, and though it didn't move, David could feel its grin. He looked away, his heart pounding. Weeks later, David sat alone in his small apartment, nursing a cup of coffee. The wound on his arm had healed, but the memories hadn't faded. Every night, he dreamed of the forest, the creature, and the sack. He avoided the highway now, taking longer routes to avoid even passing near it. One night, as he sat staring at the untouched coffee, his phone buzzed. A news alert flashed on the screen. "Trucker found dead on Hollow Bend Highway. Authorities baffled." David's hands trembled as he read the article. The description of the scene, a blood-soaked burlap sack, footprints leading into the forest, sent a chill down his spine. The curse wasn't just lingering, it was spreading. Somewhere in the dark, the creature smiled,